Let's have a look at the story of Tamar and Yehudah, Tamar and Judah. Not particularly well known in the Bible, but here it is, once more, with Legoland help. A long time passed, and then Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. After Judah had been comforted, he went up to Timnah for the shearing of his sheep, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. Tamar was told, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah for the shearing of his sheep." She changed out of her widow's clothes, wrapped a veil around her to disguise herself, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah, for she saw that, although Shelah was grown up, she had not yet been given to him. Let's have a look at what Kirsch writes. The story of Tamar suggests that there was nothing unusual about encountering and even patronizing a prostitute in the Holy Land in the days of the patriarchs. Other passages of the Bible confirm that prostitution was so commonplace that the price of a harlot's services may be as little as a loaf of bread, and that one might encounter a prostitute along the road, or even at holy sites where pilgrims congregated. Indeed, it's possible that Judah recognizes Tamar as a prostitute simply because he sees her sitting at a crossroads, a place where harlots may have typically plied their trade in biblical times. Already we have issues. Did he actually recognize her as a harlot? And then Kirsch quotes Ezekiel, "Thou hast built thy lofty place at every head of the way, and hast made thy beauty an abomination, and hast opened thy feet to every one that passed by, and multiplied thy harlotries." So there's something about the location here, at the head of every way. And yet the story of Tamar provokes a tantalizing question. Exactly how does Judah know that Tamar is a harlot in search of business? And we might wonder, is he really fooled by Tamar's disguise? We are told only that Tamar wears a veil, an essential plot device that conceals her identity from her father-in-law. But according to current scholarship on the folkways of the ancient Near East, only married women, not prostitutes, were veiled in public. If we believe Judah is tricked into thinking that Tamar is a harlot, we know that she had to adopt some other adornment or costume to signify that she is a prostitute, and thereby to arouse Judah's sexual appetite. A pendant or some other decoration on her face and around her neck might have been the way a prostitute of biblical times announced her availability as a paid sexual partner. For example, the prophet Hosea calls on his adulterous wife to put away her harlotries from her face. We'll deal with Hosea later. And her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked, which suggests to some commentators that a harlot was identifiable by the badges of her profession. Something on her face, something between her breasts, so we might imagine that Tamar wears makeup or perhaps a nose ring and hangs some object around her neck that Judah would identify as the markings of a harlot. The Song of Songs, a book of erotic love poetry that somehow found its way into Holy Writ, we'll deal with that as well. The Song of Songs suggests what woman might wear around her neck as a symbol of sexual availability. My beloved is to me as a bag of myrrh that lieth betwixt my breasts. And the Talmud confirms that wanton women would put a mixture of balsam and myrrh in their shoes so that its scent would arouse passion in young men. All we really know with certainty, of course, is that Judah decides that the woman whom he sees on the road to Timnah is sexually desirable, sexually available. He's a widower who has just completed the long period of mourning for his dead wife, and he is needful of sexual companionship. Indeed, the sparse text of Genesis 38 is fairly aglow with sexual tension at the moment of their encounter. We might surmise that a harlot's disguise is only a thin excuse, perhaps devised by Tamar, perhaps by the biblical storyteller, to justify the blunt sexual proposition that Judah makes to Tamar. Will you have sex with me is how Judah's proposition can be understood in plain English, although most translations use more decorous and euphemistic language. Let me lie with you, or let me come in unto thee. We might even imagine that Judah actually recognizes Tamar behind the veil, that he had longed for her even when she was wed to his son, that he seizes the opportunity to act out his longings. Perhaps the harlot's disguise is merely a game that each of them plays by prior arrangement or tacit consent, whether to provide plausible deniability for their love affair or to titillate each other. If so, the story of Judah and Tamar can be read not as a cautionary tale, but as an erotic love story that somehow slipped into the pages of the Holy Bible. Wow, that's pretty provocative. What do we think? Is that an acceptable argument? Don't have to agree with it at all, and certainly it's not a traditional argument, but it's based on serious scholarship. So our job, jump in there, debate it, back and forth, right or wrong, and nobody sits on the fence except your professor. Judah, seeing her, took her for a prostitute, since her face was veiled. Going up to her on the road, he said, "Here, let me sleep with you." And of course, Kirsch suggests that there's a bluntness in this. "Will you have sex with me?" is how it ought to be read. "What will you give me for sleeping with you?" she asked. Again, Kirsch weighs in on the whole idea of the sacred prostitute, the sacred whore. Biblical authors were fairly obsessed with the alluring but forbidden figure of the harlot. The Bible is studded with references to literal and metaphorical prostitution. The prophet Hosea, for example, reports that he was called upon God to go out and marry a whore. Again, we'll deal with this later on when we look at the book of Hosea in detail. Although he insists that the point of his illicit union was to rebuke his fellow Israelites for their spiritual faithlessness in worshiping strange gods. "Go, take unto thee a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land doth commit great adultery." The Bible allows us to understand that prostitution was common enough in ancient Israel, if only because harlotry among women, the women of Israel, is condemned in such strong terms. "Profane not thy daughter to make her a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry." From Leviticus 19:29. Priests are specifically prohibited from marrying a prostitute, and death by burning, the punishment prescribed for Tamar, is decreed for any daughter of a priest who turns to prostitution. The story of Tamar confirms that there were at least two kinds of prostitutes whom an Israelite man might have encountered in ancient Canaan. And this is important to understand about biblical culture. There were two kinds of prostitutes. A common whore, the term zonah is the Hebrew word for harlot, whore, prostitute, according to the original Hebrew. And a temple or cultic prostitute, kadeshah in Hebrew. Kadosh means holy in Hebrew. Kadeshah, a holy, a sacred prostitute, a cultic prostitute, whose sexual practices were sanctified among the Canaanites as a form of worship of the goddess of fertility. And that is hugely important to understand. sacred prostitution was built in to pagan religion in ancient Canaan. Tamar is described by the biblical narrative as a common prostitute, or a zonah, when we are first told how she disguises herself as a harlot to seduce her father-in-law. But when Judah sends his Canaanite crony Hira in search of the woman who is holding his seal and staff, Hira refers to the woman by the Hebrew word for a sacred temple prostitute, kadeshah, rather than a common whore. The Hebrew term kadeshah, translated as sacred or cult or temple prostitute, actually means a consecrated woman, and was understood to refer to a woman who literally made herself available to all comers at a place of pagan worship, perhaps a temple of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love, or Astarte, the Canaanite goddess of fertility. We need to be familiar with those goddesses and their names. Ishtar, Astarte. Divine intercourse was understood to be a form of prayer that would be rewarded with abundant harvests and an increase of cattle. True enough in ancient Canaan. Such titillating notions were encouraged by the chronicles of the Greek historian Herodotus, who reports that even the wealthy nations of Babylon were legally obligated to serve as sacred prostitutes at least once. More recent and discerning historians suggest that a kadeshah was actually a midwife, a wet nurse, a singer, and perhaps a sorceress rather than a prostitute. Tragically, observes Bible critic Meyer I. Gruber, scholarship suffered from scholars being unable to imagine any cultic role for women in antiquity that did not involve sexual intercourse. According to the revisionists in Bible studies, divine intercourse, if it actually took place at all, was less likely to have been the whole-scale debauchery depicted by the biblical prophets than an occasional act of ritual sexual union between a priest and a priestess on a seasonal holy day, or perhaps in time of plague, drought, or famine. Look at the range of opinion and the range of debate on so many questions. We've got to be familiar with these issues. Thus, as used by the biblical author in Genesis 38, kadeshah may not be intended as a technical term for a cult prostitute, but rather as a poetic synonym for a common or garden harlot. Think about that. Does that hold water? Kadeshah may not be intended as a technical term for cult prostitute, but a poetic synonym. It's used poetically for a common or garden harlot. To the modern reader, the reference to Tamar as a sacred prostitute rather than a common whore may suggest that the biblical author was trying to dignify and elevate Judah's dealings with the woman. We are tempted to conclude that the biblical storyteller was trying to put the best face on Judah's dalliance with the harlot by the side of the road. And here we have, indeed, the harlot by the side of the road. Of course, there is nothing sacred about the roadside transaction. It's a bargain of the oldest and most secular kind. Sex for money. And the repartee between Tamar and Judah shows us a whore haggling with a trick over the terms of payment. Indeed, the pledge that Judah gives to Tamar, his staff and his seal, is simply a form of collateral to secure his promise to pay her for the services that she's rendered, a kind of Near Eastern equivalent of a person's major credit cards, says contemporary Bible scholar and a prominent one, Robert Alter, whose name we need to be familiar with. Indeed, one scholar suggests that the casual use of the term for a sacred prostitute in Genesis 38 is the best evidence that the story itself originated with the Canaanites rather than the Israelites. There is another issue. Is this a story that was told by the Canaanites and the Israelites basically picked it up, dusted it off, and reused it and stuck it into their own sacred text? You don't have to agree with that again, but that is one theory. And as we shall see, some Bible readers go so far as to suggest that Tamar was actually the priestess of a Canaanite fertility cult who was seeking to lure Judah's sons away from the God of their fathers. But the very fact that the story of Tamar and Judah earned its way into Holy Scripture and survived the efforts of later religious authorities to rewrite the history of Israel tells us something important and surprising about the degree of tolerance towards sexual adventure that prevailed among at least some of the biblical authors and editors. So let's look again at the story, how it goes down. I will send you a kid from the flock, he said. Agreed, if you give me a pledge until you send it, she replied. What pledge shall I give you, he asked. Your seal and cord and the staff you are holding, she replied. He gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and left him. Taking off her veil, she resumed wearing her widow's clothes. Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adullamite, to recover the pledge from the woman, but he did not find her. He inquired from the men of the place, where is the prostitute who was by the roadside at Enaim? There has been no prostitute here, they answered. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is pregnant as a result of her misconduct. Bring her out, ordered Judah, and let her be burnt alive. But as she was being led off, she sent word to her father-in-law. Was the owner of these who made me pregnant, she said. Please verify whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them and said, she was right and I was wrong, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. He had no further intercourse with her. And so it goes. So let it be written, so let it be done.